They say the Lycan elite know only bloodshed, but history books omitted the terrifying executioner sobbing on the nursery floor. She broke their most sacred law by touching the royal heirs, yet her accidental slumber unearthed a devastating secret that shattered the entire kingdom. The stone walls of Blackwood Citadel were perpetually damp, sweating a mixture of mountain frost and centuries of suppressed fear. Within this impenetrable fortress, the werewolf elite ruled with iron, blood, and teeth. To be human here was to be a ghost, a fragile creature permitted to exist only so long as you remained useful and unseen. Adelaide Foster had mastered the art of being invisible. As the assistant to the Citadel's gruff apothecary, Adelaide spent her days grinding bitter herbs, boiling poultices, and keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the cobblestones. She knew the rules. Never look a Lycan in the eye, never speak unless spoken to, and above all, never cross paths with the Vanguard, the Alpha's elite guard, a cadre of lethal warriors who enforced the Pack's law with uncompromising brutality. The most feared among them was Cedric Cross. Cedric was the Alpha's shadow, the executioner, towering, heavily scarred, and possessing a gaze as cold as a frozen lake. He was a creature devoid of warmth. Whispers among the human servants claimed Cedric had no heart, that the Alpha, Gideon Sterling, had ordered it carved out to make him the perfect killing machine. Adelaide had only seen him twice. Both times, she had pressed her spine so hard against the corridor wall she bruised her own ribs, praying the faint scent of dried lavender on her apron would mask the terrified rapid beating of her human heart. But a profound, suffocating gloom had recently descended upon the Citadel, disrupting the rigid hierarchy. A month prior, tragedy had struck the royal family. Alpha Gideon's mate, Lady Vivian, had perished during childbirth. She had given the Pack 3 strong, healthy cubs, but the cost was her life. Since that night, the Citadel had felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Gideon had locked himself away in his grief, leaving the administration of the Pack and the protection of his vulnerable heirs entirely to Cedric and the Vanguard. The real crisis, however, was hidden behind the heavy oak doors of the royal nursery. The cubs were failing. In werewolf biology, the first few months of a royal bloodline's life were notoriously volatile. They were born with immense primal magic, an ancestral inheritance that required the calming, grounding presence of their mother to stabilize. Without Vivian, the cubs' magic was turning inward, manifesting as dangerously high fevers and agonizing phantom shifts. The Pack's most experienced omegas, wet nurses, and healers had tried everything. They offered the richest milk, the softest furs, and ancient Lycan lullabies, but the cubs rejected them all. They wailed day and night, a haunting, raspy sound that echoed down the stone corridors, a constant reminder of the Pack's impending doom. If the heirs died, the bloodline would break, plunging the entire territory into a civil war over succession. Adelaide heard the weeping of the Omegas in the kitchens. She saw the grim, hollowed-out faces of the Vanguard guards who patrolled the halls. The tension was bleeding into every stone of the castle. The apothecary, Master Silas, had been working for 3 days straight, brewing fever-reducing tinctures that proved useless against the cubs' magical ailment. "They burn from the inside out," Silas muttered one evening, tossing a bundle of withered wolfsbane into the hearth. He looked ancient, the firelight catching the deep lines of exhaustion on his face. The beast within them is crying out for an anchor. Without it, the fever will consume their mortal bodies before the week is out. Adelaide stood quietly in the corner, polishing a brass mortar. "Is there nothing that can soothe them?" she asked, her voice a soft, careful murmur. Silas shook his head grimly. "They reject the wolves. Every time an Omega tries to hold them, the cubs sense the submission, the fear of their royal blood. It aggravates them. They need peace, absolute and untainted. But there is no peace left in Blackwood." That night, a brutal winter storm battered the Citadel. The wind howled like a dying animal, but it was not loud enough to drown out the sudden, piercing shriek that erupted from the upper levels. It was the frantic, panicked cry of the head nurse, Beatrice. Adelaide, who had been tasked with delivering a fresh batch of clean, boiled linen to the upper wards, rose on the stairwell. A heavy, oppressive aura suddenly crashed down upon the castle. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. The magic of the dying cubs was spiraling out of control, rippling outward in waves of raw, untamed power. Adelaide gripped the heavy basket of linens to her chest, her knuckles turning white. Her instructions were clear. Leave the basket at the threshold of the den and return to the lower levels. But as she reached the top of the stairs, the sight before her shattered every rule she had ever been taught. The antechamber to the royal nursery was in sheer chaos. Two vanguard guards were on their knees, clutching their heads as the uncontrolled magical resonance of the cubs battered their heightened lichen senses. Beatrice, the head nurse, was sobbing hysterically against the wall. Her hands burned from trying to hold the feverish infants. The heavy oak doors of the inner den stood wide open, a cardinal sin in the citadel. "They're burning! They're burning up!" Beatrice wailed, rocking back and forth. Adelaide stood paralyzed. The scent emanating from the room was overwhelming, a mix of scorched pine, ozone, and the sour tang of impending death. Her survival instinct screamed at her to drop the linens and run back to the damp, safe cellars. But the sound coming from the room anchored her feet to the stone floor. It was a weak, pitiful whimpering. It did not sound like the heirs to a terrifying dynasty of monsters. It sounded like dying babies. Before her conscious mind could process the danger, her body moved. Adelaide stepped over the threshold. The heat inside the nursery was oppressive, like the inside of a blacksmith's forge. The room was lavish, draped in heavy velvet and silver ornaments. But the massive, fur-lined nest in the center of the room was a scene of devastation. 3 tiny bodies lay thrashing among the silks. They were in the agonizing, halfway state of a forced shift, their skin mottled with patches of dark fur, tiny claws extending and retracting uncontrollably. Adelaide dropped the basket. The thud made no sound over the howling wind outside. She approached the nest slowly. The magic in the room, which had incapacitated the powerful lichen guards, washed over her and simply passed through. She was human. She had no wolf spirit to agitate, no magical core for the chaotic energy to clash against. She was an empty vessel, a blank canvas in a room made of raging colors. She reached into the nest. The moment her cool, calloused human hands brushed the skin of the largest cub, the creature gasped. Adelaide flinched, expecting to be bitten, expecting the vanguard to burst in and sever her head from her shoulders. Instead, the cub stopped thrashing. The burning heat radiating from its small body seemed to seek out the coolness of her skin. Operating entirely on the maternal instinct that transcends species, Adelaide climbed into the massive nest. She gathered the 3 fragile, burning bundles into her arms. They were incredibly heavy for their size, their muscles dense and rigid. She pulled them against her chest, right over her heart. "Hush," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Hush now, little ones." She began to sway, a slow, rhythmic motion. The pack had tried to sing them, ancient lichen war chants and deep, resonant wolf lullabies. Adelaide didn't know those. Instead, she hummed a simple, forgotten human song, a melody her own mother had sung to her in a ramshackle cottage, miles away from the terror of wolves. It was a song about rain falling on a quiet tin roof, about boats drifting on still waters. Her voice was soft, carrying no magic, no dominance, and no submission. It was simply a sound of profound, quiet comfort. Miraculously, the thrashing ceased. The agonizing heat radiating from the cubs began to steadily dial down, absorbed and diffused by Adelaide's grounding human presence. One by one, their chaotic, partial shifts reversed, leaving behind 3 exhausted, fragile infants. The largest tucked his head beneath Adelaide's chin, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. The other 2 curled against her ribs, their breathing evening out into a peaceful, rhythmic slumber. The adrenaline that had carried Adelaide into the room suddenly vanished, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She had been working for 19 hours straight. The heat of the nest, the soft breathing of the infants, and the heavy velvet curtains blocking the storm outside created a cocoon of absolute safety. She meant to just close her eyes for a moment, just until their fevers completely broke, just until Beatrice recovered enough to take over. But the darkness claimed her, pulling her into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hours later, Adelaide awoke to a bone-chilling sensation. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers. The storm outside had passed, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. But it wasn't the silence that woke her. It was the smell. The undeniable, sharp scent of rain-soaked earth, iron, and blood. The scent of a predator. Adelaide's heart seized in her chest. She opened her eyes slowly, the dim light of the dawn creeping through the high windows. She was still in the royal nest. The three cubs were still sound asleep, their bodies cool and healthy, perfectly entwined with her limbs. And kneeling beside the nest, no more than an arm's length away, was Cedric Cross. Adelaide stopped breathing. The executioner was fully armored in dark leather and chainmail, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim morning light. A massive, blood-stained broadsword rested carelessly on the floor beside his knee. He had returned from a patrol, undoubtedly drawn by the sudden silence from the nursery. She was a dead woman. She was a human who had dared to handle the royal bloodline. She was contaminating their sacred den. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the brutal strike, the snarl of rage, the fatal blow that would end her miserable existence. But the silence stretched. Then she heard a sound that made her blood run colder than any threat. It was a wet, ragged gasp. Adelaide cautiously opened one eye, peering through the gloom. The fearsome captain of the vanguard, the monster who supposedly had no heart, was not looking at her with murderous rage. His scarred, rough hands were gripping the edge of the velvet nest so tightly his knuckles were white. His head was bowed, his broad shoulders shaking violently under his armor. Cedric Cross was weeping. Tears carved clean paths down his dirt and blood-smeared face, dropping silently onto the rich fabrics of the nest. He stared at the sleeping cubs, his chest heaving with silent, agonizing sobs of absolute relief. Adelaide lay completely paralyzed, holding her breath, entirely unsure of what to do as she witnessed the most lethal creature in the kingdom break down completely, laid bare by the survival of the children he had been sworn to protect. A single, treacherous floorboard creaked beneath the nest as Adelaide's trembling muscles finally betrayed her. Cedric's head snapped up with terrifying speed. In a fraction of a second, the vulnerable, weeping man vanished, replaced by the lethal apex predator the Citadel feared. He surged to his feet, his massive broadsword clearing its scabbard with a sharp, metallic hiss. The blade, still slick with the gore of whatever threat he had neutralized outside the castle walls, was pointed directly at Adelaide's throat. His chest heaved, his eyes glowing with an unnatural, feral gold. Adelaide squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the sleeping cubs closer to her chest in a futile gesture of protection. She braced for the cold bite of the steel, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Open your eyes," a voice commanded. It was not a snarl, nor the guttural growl of a beast, but a voice as rough and broken as shattered glass. Adelaide slowly opened her eyes. The tip of the broadsword was trembling, a sight no one in Blackwood Citadel had ever witnessed. Cedric was staring not at her, but at the three infants nestled peacefully against her collarbone. The angry, mottled fur that had plagued their skin was gone. Their breathing was deep and even. For the first time since their mother's death, the royal heirs were not in agony. Slowly, Cedric lowered the blade. The heavy iron clattered against the stone floor, the sound echoing through the cavernous room. The executioner sank to his knees, not in a combat stance, but in utter submission. He reached out a massive scarred hand, stopping inches from Adelaide's shoulder, terrified that his very touch might shatter the miracle before him. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "The healers, the strongest Omegas, they all failed. They were burning to ash. How did a human calm the Alpha's blood?" "I don't know," Adelaide breathed, her voice a fragile whisper. "I have no magic to fight theirs. I held them. I sang to them." Cedric closed his eyes, a fresh tear tracking through the soot on his cheek. "You saved them. You saved the bloodline." He opened his eyes, and the golden hue had softened into a deep, striking amber. "The Alpha will kill you for trespassing in the sacred den. The law demands your execution for laying hands on the heirs." Adelaide's breath hitched, the brief spark of hope extinguishing instantly. "Please, my lord, I only wanted to comfort them, and I will burn this citadel to the ground before I let anyone harm you for it," Cedric vowed, the solemn weight of his words sending a shiver down her spine. "From this moment on, you do not leave this room. You are not a servant. You are the royal anchor, Thus began the strangest and most dangerous chapter of Adelaide's life. Cedric enforced her new position with terrifying authority. When Alpha Gideon Sterling, a massive, brooding brute of a man whose grief had twisted into a volatile paranoia, demanded to know why a human was holding his children, Cedric stepped between them. With his hand resting menacingly on the hilt of his sword, Cedric informed the Alpha that the human's lack of magical resonance was the only cure for the cub's fever. Gideon, desperate to secure his lineage, begrudgingly agreed, but placed Adelaide under constant, suffocating guard. She was locked in the royal nursery, surrounded by luxury but trapped in a gilded cage. Yet, she was never truly alone. Cedric took over the night watch personally. The vanguard whispered that their ruthless captain had gone mad, abandoning his comfortable quarters to sleep on the hard stone floor of the nursery, wrapped only in his dark cloak. In the quiet, candlelit hours of the night, the terrifying executioner and the invisible human apothecary assistant forged an impossible bond. Adelaide learned that Cedric's scars were not from ruthless conquests, but from defending the late Lady Vivian and her sisters during a rogue ambush years ago. She learned that he hated the taste of the Citadel's wine, preferred the smell of pine over incense, and possessed a surprisingly dry, biting wit. In return, Cedric watched her. He watched the gentle, meticulous way she fed the cubs, the way her laughter tinkled like wind chimes when the eldest cub tugged on her braided hair. He found himself drawn to the quiet strength she possessed, a resilience that rivaled the fiercest lichen warriors. One evening, as a harsh winter draft blew through the nursery, Adelaide shivered in her thin linen dress. Without a word, Cedric stood, unclasped his heavy, fur-lined vanguard mantle, and draped it over her shoulders. The cloak smelled of leather, snow, and his deeply intoxicating, earthy scent. "You must stay warm," he murmured, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second on her shoulders. "They need you." Adelaide looked up, meeting his amber eyes. The distance between them had completely vanished. "And what do you need, Cedric?" she asked, boldly using his given name. Cedric's jaw tightened. He looked at her lips, then up to her eyes, his expression a mixture of profound longing and agonizing restraint. "Something I am forbidden to have," he whispered, before abruptly turning away to stoke the fire. The romance blossoming in the shadows of the nursery was a beautiful, fragile thing, but outside those heavy oak doors, a dark storm was gathering. The cubs were growing stronger, but Alpha Gideon was growing increasingly erratic. He rarely visited his children, and when he did, his presence caused the cubs to wail in distress. The magical dissonance between father and children was terrifying. It was during one of these violent episodes that Adelaide's apothecary training noticed something that would unravel the entire kingdom. The discovery happened purely by accident. The youngest cub, a frail girl, had developed a mild rash. Remembering a soothing salve Master Silas used to keep in the upper wards, Adelaide began searching through the carved mahogany cabinets that had once belonged to the late Lady Vivian. Tucked away in the very back of a bottom drawer, hidden beneath layers of moth-eaten silk, Adelaide's fingers brushed against something hard. It was a small, velvet-lined lockbox. Curiosity overriding her caution, Adelaide pried it open using a silver hairpin. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and a small crystal vial containing a few drops of a murky, violet liquid. Adelaide unstoppered the vial and gave it a cautious sniff. Her blood ran cold. The scent was unmistakable. It was a complex, highly illegal amalgamation. She remembered studying the forbidden medical journals of Dr. William Harvey, a real human physician who had secretly mapped the circulation of lichen blood before his execution in 1657. Harvey had documented a specific undetectable poison used during the lichen wars, a mixture of monkshood and arsenic, designed to mimic the symptoms of severe magical exhaustion. It was an abortifacient, meant to kill an unborn cub and the mother from the inside out. Trembling, Adelaide opened Vivian's journal. The handwriting was frantic, the ink blotted with what looked like dried tears. As Adelaide read the late Luna's final entries, the devastating truth of Blackwood Citadel began to slot into place, horrifying in its scope. "The Alpha knows," the final entry read. "Gideon has realized the mating bond never truly took root. He knows the children I carry are not his. The forced claiming right he used to bind me is shattering. I feel the poison in my tea, the slow, burning ache in my bones. He cannot risk the pack finding out he is sterile, that his bloodline is dead. He means to kill me and the cubs in childbirth and play the grieving widower. I must find a way to get word to Cedric. He is the true father. He is the only one who can protect our children. Adelaide dropped the journal, her hands shaking violently. The breath was knocked from her lungs. The cubs weren't rejecting Gideon because they missed their mother. They were rejecting him because his blood was a foreign, hostile entity. They were rejecting the man who had murdered their mother. And the fearsome captain of the vanguard, the man who had wept over their sickbed, was their true father, entirely unaware of his own lineage. Adelaide? She spun around. Cedric was standing in the doorway, his brow furrowed in concern as he took in her pale face and trembling frame. He stepped into the room, his eyes dropping to the open journal and the vial in her hands. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low. "Cedric, you have to look at this," she choked out, tears of sheer terror welling in her eyes. "Vivian, she didn't die of complications. She was murdered. Gideon poisoned her." Cedric froze. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, snatching the journal from her hands. Adelaide watched as his eyes darted across the frantic handwriting. She watched the color drain from his face, replaced by a terrifying, ashen pallor. When he reached the line about the true parentage of the cubs, Cedric stopped breathing. The massive warrior swayed on his feet, the revelation striking him with the force of a physical blow. He looked slowly toward the nest, where the 3 cubs were tumbling playfully over one another, his children, the heirs to nothing but a stolen legacy and a murdered mother. A low, guttural sound began to build in Cedric's chest, a sound of absolute, primal agony and earth-shattering rage. It was the sound of a monster whose chains had just been utterly destroyed. His eyes flared a brilliant, blinding gold, and the air in the room crackled with the sudden, violent surge of his unleashed aura. "He killed her," Cedric snarled, the sound vibrating the very stones of the floor. "He killed my mate, and he tried to kill my children." Before Adelaide could reach out to him, the heavy oak doors of the nursery were kicked open with an explosive crash. Standing in the threshold was Alpha Gideon. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed Vanguard defectors, men loyal only to his coin, not to Cedric. Gideon's eyes were bloodshot, his lips curled back in a sneer of pure malice as his gaze locked onto the journal in Cedric's hand. "I wondered how long it would take the loyal attack dog to find his bitch's diary," Gideon spat, drawing a massive serrated blade. "It's a pity. You were a useful weapon, Cedric. But the human has made you soft, and now she has made you a liability." Gideon pointed his blade directly at Adelaide. "Kill the human, slaughter the bastards, and bring me the executioner's head." The nursery, once a sanctuary of quiet healing, instantly transformed into a slaughterhouse. Gideon's command hung in the air for barely a second before the 6 Vanguard defectors lunged. They moved with the terrifying speed of fully trained lichen killers, their eyes burning with unnatural malice, weapons drawn to spill the blood of the innocent. But they had fundamentally miscalculated one crucial element. They were attacking a father who had just realized what he had to lose. Cedric did not simply fight, he erupted. With a roar that shook the very foundations of Blackwood's citadel, Cedric dropped Vivian's journal and intercepted the first 2 guards. He didn't even bother to draw his broadsword. Moving faster than the human eye could track, he seized the first defector by the throat and the armored chest plate, lifting the massive man off the floor and hurling him with bone-shattering force into the stone wall. The second guard thrust a spear towards Cedric's ribs, but the executioner shattered the wooden shaft with his bare forearm, driving his fist into the traitor's jaw with a sickening crunch. "Adelaide! The hearth!" Cedric bellowed over the din of clashing steel and snarling wolves, unsheathing his broadsword in a flash of deadly silver to meet the remaining 4 attackers. Adelaide did not freeze. The timid, invisible, apothecary assistant had died the moment she held the royal cubs in her arms. Operating on pure adrenaline and protective instinct, she dove across the floor, dodging a sweeping blade that sheared off the hem of her linen dress. She reached the fireplace, her hands frantically digging into the deep pockets of her apron. She carried a pouch of concentrated wolfsbane powder, a highly toxic irritant Master Silas used in minuscule doses for surgical sterilization. As a third guard bypassed Cedric and lunged toward the nest with a drawn dagger, Adelaide hurled the entire pouch directly into the blazing embers of the hearth. The reaction was instantaneous. The fire flared violently, shifting from a warm orange to a toxic, blinding green. A thick, acrid cloud of smoke billowed outward. For Adelaide, the smoke was merely unpleasant, stinging her eyes and making her cough. But for the lichens, with their hypersensitive olfactory glands and magical biology, it was devastating. The guard leaping toward the cubs shrieked, dropping his dagger as he clawed blindly at his own throat, his respiratory system seizing from the aerosolized wolfsbane. Cedric, anticipating the blast, had already pulled his heavy cloak over his face, holding his breath as he ruthlessly dispatched the blinded defectors. His broadsword sang a grim, fatal song, cutting down the men who had betrayed their oaths. Within 60 seconds, the 6 elite guards lay dead or incapacitated on the nursery floor, but Alpha Gideon remained. The smoke began to clear, sucked out by the winter draft from the high windows. Gideon stood in the center of the room, unscathed. He had shifted. He was no longer a man, but a monstrous, hulking beast of nightmare. A 9-foot-tall dire wolf, with matted black fur, venomous yellow eyes, and jaws capable of snapping a horse's spine in two. A low, vibrating growl rumbled from Gideon's chest, rattling the glassware on the apothecary shelves. He looked at the dead guards, then at Cedric, his massive maw dripping with anticipation. Cedric did not retreat. He tossed his bloodied broadsword aside. The weapon was useless against a fully shifted Alpha. As Adelaide watched from the floor, shielding the crying cubs with her own body, Cedric's human form began to ripple and expand. The sound of cracking bone and tearing muscle filled the room as the captain of the vanguard unleashed his own beast. Cedric's wolf was a breathtaking terror. He was leaner than Gideon, built for lethal speed rather than brute force, his fur the color of a moonless night, slashed through with the stark, white scars of his past battles. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Adelaide's lungs. They were not the yellow of a standard wolf, nor the red of a rogue. They burned with a brilliant, blinding, incandescent gold, the unmistakable mark of a true alpha. The two behemoths collided with the force of a falling mountain. The impact shattered the mahogany cabinets and pulverized the stone floor. Fur, blood, and splintered wood filled the air. Gideon fought with the desperate, chaotic fury of a cornered usurper, his massive jaws snapping and tearing at Cedric's shoulders. But Cedric fought with the icy, calculated precision of an executioner defending his family. The battle spilled out of the nursery and into the grand antechamber. By now, the deafening noise had drawn the rest of the citadel. Hundreds of pack members, Omegas, and loyal Vanguard guards flooded the upper levels, forming a massive, horrified circle around the fighting wolves. The pack law dictated that no one could interfere in an alpha challenge. They could only watch as their world tore itself apart. Gideon managed to pin Cedric, his massive jaws clamping down viciously on Cedric's foreleg. A sickening crack echoed through the hall. Cedric let out a deafening roar of pain, but the agony only fueled the golden fire in his eyes. Tapping into a well of primal magic he had never known he possessed, Cedric twisted his body with impossible strength. He kicked Gideon off, his hind legs catching the alpha in the chest and sending him crashing through a solid stone pillar. Before Gideon could recover from the rubble, Cedric was upon him, his jaws locked securely around Gideon's throat in an unbreakable, fatal grip. Gideon thrashed violently, his claws gouging deep trenches into the stone, but Cedric's hold was absolute. He did not tear the throat out. He simply held the usurper down, letting his terrifying golden aura wash over the gathered pack. The crushing, magical weight of Cedric's dominance forced every single lichen in the hall to their knees. It was a resonance so pure, so ancient, that it rewrote the hierarchy of Blackwood Citadel in a matter of seconds. As Gideon's thrashing weakened, the truth resonated through the pack bond. Gideon was a sterile, murderous fraud. Cedric Cross was the true bloodline, the rightful alpha, undeniably cemented by the survival of his heirs. With a final, pathetic shudder, Gideon Sterling went still. The usurper was dead. A profound, breathless silence descended upon the ruined antechamber. Slowly, Cedric released his grip on the dead alpha. He stood tall, his dark fur matted with blood, his golden eyes sweeping over the hundreds of kneeling wolves. They bowed their heads, baring their necks in absolute submission to their new king. But Cedric did not look at them. He turned his massive, bloodied head back toward the splintered doorway of the royal nursery. He shifted back into his human form. Naked, heavily scarred, and bleeding from a dozen brutal wounds, he ignored the gasps of the pack and limped directly toward the room. Someone threw a heavy fur mantle over his shoulders, which he barely acknowledged. Adelaide was still kneeling on the floor beside the nest, trembling violently, her hands covered in soot from the wolfsbane powder. The three cubs were crying, agitated by the violence and the terrifying display of magic. Cedric dropped heavily to his knees in front of her, the fearsome executioner, the newly crowned alpha of Blackwood Citadel. He ignored his injuries and gently reached out to cup Adelaide's soot-stained face in his massive, rough hands. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice raw and shaking. "No," Adelaide whispered, a tear cutting a clean line down her dirty cheek. "I'm safe. They are safe." Cedric let out a shuddering breath, pressing his forehead against hers. "Because of you. Only because of you." He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the faint scent of dried lavender and the grounding, undeniable humanity that had saved his soul. The doorway filled with the senior members of the pack, including Master Silas and an awestruck Beatrice. They stared at the impossible scene, their terrifying new alpha holding a human apothecary assistant, as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. "My alpha," Master Silas spoke cautiously, bowing his head. "The pack awaits your command. And the human. The law states—" "The law is dead," Cedric interrupted, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority, though he never took his eyes off Adelaide. He pulled back just enough to look into her beautiful, terrified human eyes. "You are no servant, Adelaide Foster," Cedric declared, his words carrying the heavy, magical weight of a royal decree, binding her to his soul in a way no forced claiming right ever could. "You are the mother to my children. You are the anchor to my magic. And if you will have a scarred, broken monster like me, you are the Luna of Blackwood Citadel." Adelaide looked at the man who had terrified her for years, the man who had wept over a crib, the man who had just ripped a kingdom apart to keep her safe. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, overwhelming love. "I will have you," she whispered, her voice steady and clear. "All of you." Years later, the history books of Blackwood Citadel would be rewritten. The dark, bloody reign of Gideon the Usurper became a cautionary tale, while the era of Alpha, Cedric, and Luna Adelaide became legend. The damp, oppressive gloom of the Citadel vanished, replaced by the warmth of roaring fires and the sound of children's laughter. The human servants were freed, integrated into the pack as honored citizens, protected fiercely by the new laws penned by the Luna herself. On a quiet winter night, identical to the one that had changed their lives forever, Cedric sat by the hearth in their grand bedchamber. He watched with a soft, affectionate smile as Adelaide tucked 5 children into the massive royal nest, the 3 elder heirs, now strong and thriving, and the 2 new additions, a pair of rambunctious twins who possessed their mother's bright eyes and their father's indomitable spirit. As Adelaide finished her quiet, human lullaby, Cedric wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her flush against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, his golden eyes entirely at peace. She had accidentally fallen asleep beside the cubs, but in doing so, she had awakened a kingdom and taught a monster how to love. Did you love this thrilling tale of forbidden romance, betrayal, and fierce maternal instinct? If Adelaide and Cedric's fight for their family kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this story with fellow fantasy lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for more captivating werewolf dramas. Please drop a quick comment down below with your favorite plot twist.